Channel 604.
Welcome back. You're on Outsiders with Rowan Dean, who you can find at Rowan Dean on Twitter, or as the editor of the Spectator Australia magazine. I once accused him of contributing to the magazine, but he flatly refused that accolade. My name's Ross Cameron. And we did ask Rowan, whom, as you know, is on work experience here at Sky News, and he's learning how to do television, and we asked him to do an interview on his own, unsupervised.
Yeah, because you didn't turn up.
Because
you didn't turn up.
Minister for Energy. He cut a fairly long and rambling interview. We have cut it down to the highlights, the best 14 minutes. Rowan was there as I played the snippet. There were tears streaming down his face.
That was Pauline Hanson. That was.
So here we've got a bit of Western civilisation, a bit of Professor Ridd, the sacked Queensland University marine physicist. We have, and of course, the big questions of Paris, climate, motor vehicles. Ladies and gentlemen, Rowan Dean and the Minister for Energy, Josh Frydenberg.
It was outrageous that the union and the student association at the ANU said it was radical and racist to teach the benefits of Western civilization, because to, paraphrase the life of Brian, Rowan, what did Western civilization ever do for us? Well, it did a lot more than giving us aqueducts or a bit of good wine. What it did was it taught us about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, rule of law, democracy, intellectual and artistic curiosity. That is what the Western civilization and the teachings of its history is why it's so important. So I think all good people stand with us in supporting the teaching of Western civilization, the offering of scholarships by the Ramsay Centre, and we need to rebuke and condemn those who seek to demean its importance and the contribution that it has made to the society we have today.
Now, Josh, you again came out very bravely, I thought, and very sensibly, and said it is outrageous that Peter Ridd be punted from the university like this, and you defended his right to take an unorthodox point of view on the basis that this is what Western science is all about, the rigour of scientific scepticism.
Voltaire was alleged to have said, I might disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And I think that principle applies here, because Peter Ridd is a professor of more than 2 decades standing. He has many academic writings to his name. And while the reef does face some very significant challenges, which do include climate change, and we have seen some severe bleaching events in recent years, it's also right to point out that there's been bleaching events back in 1981, 82, in 97, 98.
Now, Peter Ridd has requested that of the $500 million that's was in the budget to go towards reef research, he specifically asked, well, why not even just donate 1% of that to looking at the alternative point of view, in other words, to check whether the climate change science is in fact correct. You say your colleagues, or some of your colleagues, support you in your support of Peter Ridd. What's wrong with that idea? Is that not a good idea, to put aside some money to check the science of climate change?
Well, it won't surprise you to know that as the Minister for the Environment, I do accept the science, and I do look to the agencies that advise me, whether it's the CSIRO, whether it's the Bureau of Meteorology, whether it's my own department, for that advice. That being said, there is an independent scientific advisory committee that stands to look at the way the money is spent with the barrier reef, and there is an expert panel as well with Professor Peter Chubb that provides advice to government around the reef. And it's incumbent upon all these groups to continuously test the scientific assumptions, to continue to ensure we have best practice,
And okay, so of those scientists who advise the government, you mentioned several bodies, the CSIRO, presumably your own Ministry for the Environment is a large outfit in Canberra. Of those people that you sit in lengthy meetings with around the big boardroom tables, how many would you actually say are climate change skeptics?
Well, I don't seek to put a number on that because that is not the question that I ask.
Well, that is the question. Is there a single person advising you who is sceptical of climate change of the science of climate change to the extent that Peter Ridd is? Is there a single person advising you in Canberra that would fit the same Peter Ridd wear the same Peter Ridd hat of scepticism?
Well, I think what Peter Ridd is saying is slightly different to that, Rowan. What he's saying is that when you look at peer-reviewed science, you shouldn't just necessarily accept that as fact.
That's true, absolutely.
And that you shouldn't overstate the diabolical situation with the reef. He's not denying the reef is facing significant challenges. He's just denying the extent of maybe some of those challenges. Now,
well, his key point, Josh, is that the reef is not under the threat that it has been made out to be, and also his point is that there are so many industries in the far north Queensland that are threatened, agriculture industry, tourism, etc., by the climate change, the fear that the reef is dying, and this is putting a brake on a lot of industry, a brake on development, a brake on mining, agriculture, and so on. So his fear is for the economy of Queensland. Now, my question is, do you have any advisors who are not completely committed to the climate change science? In other words, anyone sceptical of climate change, of the belief of climate change, of man-made global warming?
I think the people who are advising government more generally are professionals, and I think what they do is they test their theories. Now, people will test their theories in different ways and maybe even to different extents. But I don't, you know...
So there are no... So I'm taking from this, Josh, there's no one who sits in a meeting with you who is sceptical of the science. So can I just ask the question, therefore, is the advice you're getting the consensus that climate change is real and is happening? Would that be fair to say that that is the consensus of the advice you get?
I think that is fair, and I would add to that human activity is contributing to it.
Right, and so the consensus is that the climate change is real, it's happening, and therefore that's what drives government policy.
Well, certainly that is what is driving government response, and that is what has driven government to sign up to the Paris Treaty.
Okay, so can I just, on the question of consensus, can I just quote Patrick Moore, who says that consensus is a political and social concept. It is not relevant in science. Anyone who involves it in discussions of science is either ignorant or a charlatan. This is Patrick Moore, a well-known British scientist. Science is about controlled observation and replication leading to the truth, period. Now, you see that with Peter Ridd. You've supported that with Peter Ridd. You support that with the Ramsay Centre. Do you support that with climate change science and climate change policy?
Well, I continually will advocate for the most rigorous analysis of scientific methods, scientific conclusions, scientific theory.
Would your cabinet colleagues agree with you that James Cook University must be hauled over the coals by the government, well, not necessarily over the coals, and told that they must reinstate Peter Ridd, otherwise you will withdraw funding, because you believe in the rigour of the scientific method, and they are clearly flouting that. Why should the taxpayer fund James Cook University when you are in a position to tell them that they must do what you just said, which is pursue the scientific method ruthlessly to expose their own theories to scepticism? Would you withdraw funding for James Cook?
I don't think James Cook University would be under any illusion as to what the view of the government is.
Excellent. I'm thrilled. Excellent. Good. Well, I'm pleased to hear that.
They've heard from the Education Minister. They've heard from the Environment.
Well, that gives me hope, Josh. That definitely gives me hope. Now, I just wanted to ask you, we've talked about the science of climate change. To you, personally, as an individual, is climate change a question of science, or is it a question of morality? Where does it fall?
Well, of course it's a question of science. We need to move away from passing moral judgments about these particular issues, because What we need to do is deal in the facts. And I know that you and I will agree to disagree on this point, but I have accepted the advice that I have received in relation to this, and I'm taking action on it. But where I disagree vehemently with my political opponents is about the nature of that response. The Labor Party will pursue recklessly high targets that are not costed, that are not funded, that in the case of the electricity sector will add an extra tax, will drive prices higher, and in the case of the other parts of the economy will have a similar chilling effect on business, investment and on jobs. We are 1.3% of the world's global emissions, and we should never lose sight of that. That being said, we're part of a collective effort.
Okay, well, I'll just hold you there, and I'll just quickly play you, Josh. You're probably familiar with it, but on that 1.3%, we're saying that climate change is a question of science. Here's the answer from the chief scientist who works for the government, for the Turnbull government, Alan Finkel, responding in the Senate to just how much effect our efforts will have on that global temperature. Let's just have a quick look at that.
In Australia, we emit less than 1.3% of the world's carbon emissions.
About that.
Now, if we were to reduce the world's emissions of carbon by 1.3%, what impact would that make on the changing climate of the world?
Virtually nothing.
So we're putting aside the moral issue. We've said the morality is not an issue. It's the scientific question. So if the chief scientist says, Josh, that everything Australia is doing is not going to change global temperatures at all, virtually nothing, his words, why are we doing it?
Well, we're part of a global response, and if every country in the world which had less than 2%...
But isn't that a moral question? Why is that a scientific question? Because we know that we can... Science is about numbers and facts. We know we can't do anything, so you're saying that we have to signal to the rest of the world that it's important to do. That's a moral question, not a scientific question, surely.
No, that's not right, Rowan. What I'm saying is that if there is a collective international effort, then action will make a difference on climate change, but you need to have that international collective effort. Now, countries with less than 2% of the world's emissions make up over 40% of global emissions. Now, if all of those countries got together and did nothing, then you'd be taking a big chunk out of the response. So we do need to take action, but it needs to be proportionate action, and it needs to be cost-effective action, and it needs to be done in step with the rest of the world. And that is why I am pursuing policies that are quite different to what the Labor Party would pursue if they were in office. And under the Labor Party, you'll always pay more for your power, you'll have an electricity tax, and you'll have a repeat of the disaster of when they were last in government.
No, I accept that, Josh, and the last thing I would ever want to see is a Labor government back in power in this country. They're an absolute disaster.
Two of us.
But you've just said we should be in step with the rest of the world, but the reality is, Josh, we're way, way, way in front of the rest of the world. China's not going to do anything till 2030 at the barest minimum. Russia, India, Brazil, none of those countries are doing anything. We're way out in front with the highest electricity prices in the world. So how can we justify the fact that we're not actually going to ever contribute to lowering global temperatures? How can we justify that when we're so far out in front? We've got 100,000 people disconnected because they can't afford to pay their electricity bills, who this winter will be freezing and having a very miserable standard of life. How can we justify that when the science says clearly there's no point in us doing anything? And you've said it's not a moral issue. If it's a moral issue, why aren't we looking after our own people rather than signalling to the rest of the world that we want to get out in front of them? Or why are we so far out in front? What's the point, Josh?
Well, the reality is the rest of the world is moving. Now, obviously, the United States has signalled its intention to pull out of Paris, but emissions are declining in the US as they benefit from the shale gas revolution, which is actually making gas more affordable and meaning that coal is playing a reduced role in the overall energy mix. But the reality about our energy system is, whether you like it or not, Rowan, we're actually living in a more carbon-constrained environment.
But only a self-imposed one. Only a self-imposed. This is my point. It's self-imposed.
Yeah,
we have more. There's no need for us to have a carbon-constrained thing. Now, I'll just leave it there, Josh. We'll obviously agree to disagree on that. Thank you so much for coming on Outsiders. Absolute delight to chat to you. As always, hope we'll do it again. And thank you so much. And keep up the great work defending Western civilization, Josh. We need that.
Thanks, Rowan.